Michelle Rowland, as we await the numbers to come in, one of the questions, we've discussed this with Chris Kenny earlier, was about the question of detail or lack of detail around the proposal. Would it have been better, as Noel Pearson and Marcia Langton and others said they would, legislate first, or at least have an exposure draft of a bill before going to a referendum, just to placate people who might have been concerned?
Well, I think there's a couple of points here. Firstly, the fact is that the Constitution establishes those heads of power, and it's for governments to determine what is actually legislated under those. This is the form of recognition the First Nations people asked for, and your very comprehensive packages there demonstrated the long gestation of this, why it got to this point, and why it was determined that recognition should not be symbolic, it should not be done through legislation, but it should be done through constitutional change. So I think the fact that we have been told this, Australians were told this is the way in which we went about executing this, actually reflected what had been determined over so many years. And I take the points that have been made by a number of the panellists. As Peter said, would a less ambitious question have succeeded? You asked the question, would it have succeeded under a Liberal leader? Of course, we'll never know. But again, I make the point that a less ambitious question is not what was asked for here. And I also, I take the point that Andrew made about were these conflicting messages about was it a big deal or not a big deal? The point being made here was that it's not a big deal for me as a non-Indigenous person to vote yes, but it makes a big difference to First Nations Australians to have that yes vote. And the last point I'll make here is it would be absolutely remiss not to note that in those packages, the great father of reconciliation there, Pat Dodson, whatever side you take in this debate and however you voted today, no one would doubt that man's passion, his commitment, his intelligence, his conviction. And I'm sure that we all acknowledge that he has not been well, but we wish him absolutely the very best. And I also acknowledge, in all decency, members such as Julian Leeser, Andrew Gee, and also Ken Wyatt, former Liberal minister, who had the courage of their convictions to take a view which was contrary to their own parties in this. So again, I acknowledge them in all sincerity. We saw that there were a number of people who might not traditionally vote along party lines who have chosen to vote a certain way today. And I'll just make the very last point I'll make. Western Sydney is a big place. I was out today, the polling booth I was at today was in Stanhope Gardens, which is Mortgage Belt Central. And not a single voter whom I engaged with today said to me, you should be focused on cost of living. We discussed cost of living issues continuously throughout the electorate, but there was not a single voter who came up to me today and said that that was a reason that they were voting no. I must say it was a very civil booth. The volunteers on both sides were very civil, but there were long queues, lots of people engaged, lots of people still making up their minds as well. And again, I would just reiterate, Australians always get it right, and we will know soon enough how they have decided in this referendum. But I will say this, the status quo is absolutely unsustainable, what we've got in this country. We have gone backwards when it comes to closing the gap. We need to do something different, and that was what this referendum was all about.
I think on that, we also need to understand the inequity that exists. When we talk about the cost of living, you live out in these communities, you understand the cost of living in these communities. You go into the Northern Territory where people have got electricity cards that you've got to top your electricity card up to get power to your home. Where else do we do that in the country? You talk about food on the table. You're paying $8 for a bottle of milk. Where's that happening anywhere else in the country?
Sean, just to be fair, there are a lot. Hang on. There are a lot. I grew up in a small country town. There are a lot of country towns.
We've got to be absolutely
people
clear
are doing it tough.
of the inequity that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country, and we've got to understand that. The other thing that we need to reflect on, that it actually took this referendum. We have an election every 3 years in this country at a federal level. It took this referendum to give the Australian Electoral Commission a kick, and it took the referendum working group to do that, to give the Australian Electoral Commission a kick to get off their butts, to get out there and get Aboriginal people registered to vote. But we have an election every 3 years. It took the referendum working group a voice to tell the government we need Aboriginal people registered to vote.
One of the key issues, we touched on it earlier, which seems to be one of the great vulnerabilities of that Yes campaign. And Anthony Dillon is with us, an Aboriginal man who is opposed to the voice. You've argued strongly against it. Sean Gordon strongly for it. But that division in the Indigenous community has been quite a powerful one, with Jacinta Price, the most prominent no campaigner. Explain to our viewers why you landed on the position you did as against this.
Okay, because what we're seeing today with the voice is actually, it's a similar thing to what I was talking about 25 years ago, this assumption that Indigenous Australians are fundamentally different to non-Indigenous Australians and that they have different needs. They don't. Certainly those needs may be met differently to varying degrees, but we all have the same fundamental needs. And I do oppose, this, when we say, oh, we spoke to the Aboriginal people. Well, which Aboriginal people? We're not all one homogenous group. And I think that's been, to see them as one homogenous group has been to the detriment of Indigenous wellbeing over many years. So my reason for voting no is I do not see them as one group. They're individuals. They have different likes, different dislikes, that sort of thing. And this voice seems to make this assumption, you have an Indigenous person, therefore you can only have Indigenous people who look after them and make decisions for them.
Anthony, you and I have